It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. The German philosopher Hegel believed that it is through externalization that the mind realizes itself. As an idealist and a historical determinist, he believed that our concrete material experiences and realities are dictated and governed by abstract patterns, ideas, and interpretations, in essence, ideology. Hegel had argued that all previous moments in history were the unfolding of ideas, symbolism, concepts, and truth, dialectically moving and propelling us forward. To him, truth was an idea, idealism. For Marx, however, this reconciliation is completely unacceptable, and that Hegel's emphasis on the state, symbolism, and historical processes and inertia can lead to an ideological justification of existing power structures. He criticizes submission to idealistic principles and the subsequent obfuscation of underlying social, political, and economic realities as he believed Hegel had advocated.
According to Leszek Kolakowski, ideology in this sense is a false consciousness or an obfuscated mental process in which men don't understand the forces that actually guide their thinking, but imagine it to be wholly governed by logic and intellectual influences.
Later, the French structuralist and Marxist thinker Louis Althusser proposed a more nuanced approach to understanding social formations, where various external and internal factors subtly and dynamically interact and influence each other in the process of overdetermination. Influenced by Marx's later works, he particularly warns against establishing society as an abstraction of the individual, as an ontologically distinct category. Althusser dissected the base or superstructure dichotomy of Marx and recognized that those in control of the base could affect the superstructure. He wanted to introduce a plausible way in which this could happen. Althusser describes interpolation as the process where an individual is treated as a subject. The subject could, however, get out of ideology, thereby understanding reality, for example, by seeing the real economic base of ideology or the superstructure. Marx's belief is that once we have a scientific grasp of reality, then we are not in ideology. For Althusser, like Lacan, however, this is impossible because such a subject relies on language. Rather, the subject can only approach the real by representing the processes which interpolate it as ideological.
As stated by Althusser, all ideology hails or interpolates concrete individuals as concrete subjects by the functioning of the category of the subject.
Or, in other words, we cease to treat others as truly unique individuals, but rather categorize their identity and whether they belong to a certain group or subculture. This is similar to what Ken Wilber thought of as the internal collective quadrant or domain of human experience, which represents the underlying structure of language, culture, value systems, ideologies, and worldviews, and its relationship with the phenomenology of the individuals who are part of or embedded within these structures.
Louis Althusser, in explaining the mechanism of power, argued that those in power exercise influence in two ways, through the repressive state apparatus and the ideological state apparatus. The repressive state apparatus is made up of the government, the administration, the army, the police, the courts, judiciary, the prisons, in short, structures that function by exercising power directly. Through means of repression, fear, and censorship, the threat of violence, legal repercussions, and disciplinary measures, the dominant classes leverage their political and material resources, juridical power, repressive policy making to exercise their power and control over the masses. Direct exercise of power, however, doesn't necessarily require the use of instrumental means or force. A teacher has the power to assign grades to students, which would then go on to affect their employment opportunities and hence their socioeconomic status. The teacher doesn't hold a gun over the student's head, but the student knows that the power they do have has an effect on the student's own future choices and possible actions. The police and legal system operate the same way, where the constant threat of violence in response to insubordination and the fear of dire consequences ensures that people don't challenge the power or class structure. In this way, the state coerces its populace into compliance.
As stated by Michel Foucault in Discipline and Punishment, discipline makes individuals. It is the specific technique of a power that regards individuals both as objects and as instruments of its exercise.
Althusser argues that the use of such violent and repressive tactics won't be sustainable since it fosters resentment and frustration among the masses and could possibly result in resistance and mutiny. To Althusser, the key in reproducing the condition of production becomes a question of ideology. Through using subtle ideological and political tools to control the dominant political and social discourse, process and narrative to establish a society of control with far greater confidence in obedience. The goal then of the ideological state apparatus to create a way that interpolates individual into subject in such a way that it seems adventurous or beneficial for the individual, so it no longer seems like ideology or interpolation but rather common sense.
Without critical take on ideology, everyone would see themselves as being outside of it. It is a matter of how ideology makes itself as normal conduct and shapes the fundamental lens through which one perceives and interprets reality. Embedded in the background of material processes, it influences our thoughts, values, perception, and identities in subtle but significant ways. Most people wouldn't think that the way we are taught at schools has some ideological background and aims that is establishes certain ideas and beliefs about the nature of merit, success, competition, alliance, and collaboration.
Marxists and critical thinkers acknowledge this, that ideology is not something taught. Capital relations aren't taught in schools, but it is practiced, observed, and internalized. It teaches us to comply and rely on frameworks provided by concrete or abstract authority figures and frameworks, or philosophies to decide and rationalize how we think and act. Instrumental reasoning becomes an extension of the existing bureaucracy in that it requires the objectification and subsequent idealization of systems, and therefore justifying attaching a reason to preserve them as absolute authoritative principles.
Patterns, way of thinking and reacting, principal truths and values have become so ingrained into our culture, language, and social structure that people have internalized them as fundamental, or in other words, human nature, which are then retroactively used to justify the preservation of the system that the dominant classes benefit from. Posits the market as the most objective and rational thing, and therefore one must trust it and not question its authority. If the market fails or collapses, it's simply because it's what rationality dictates, not an inherent or internal flaw in the design of the system itself. So, trust the science, or what the bureaucracy like to label as science, or leveraging the culture and socially reinforced structure of patriarchy and hegemony to shape the identity, value, and the segment of the parts of the social and political landscape they are allowed to traverse.
Film and literary media devices are used to reinforce the libertarian capital myths and a means of sublimation, portraying success as synonymous with obtaining monetary value and commodities, that those who succeed do so because they are more meritorious, productive, and contribute more value to society. It's also used to establish the narrative that the police or the government only resort to violence against forces of evil, that truth, or at least the notion of truth that's predicated on their own political agenda, always triumphs, that their notion of justice and law are abstract universal absolutes that cannot be critiqued, along with perpetuating the belief that things could have been a lot worse. Social media algorithms and censorship are more effective at establishing and controlling and influencing the dominant political narratives and discourses, with the notion of value being reduced to commodification, material possession, and relinquishing control over what we desire and should desire to advertisements, curated trends, and pop culture.
The mass media serve as a system for communicating messages and symbols to the general populace. It is their function to amuse, entertain, and inform, and to inculcate individuals with the values, beliefs, and codes of behavior that will integrate them into the institutional structures of the larger society. In a world full of concentrated wealth and major conflicts of class interest, to fulfill this role requires systematic propaganda.
The rule of Awami League, a political party in Bangladesh, provides us glaring examples of how repressive and ideological state apparatuses can function in practice. During Sheikh Hasina's reign, the Awami League had harnessed both repressive and ideological state apparatuses to solidify its rule and suppress opposition. The state's control over these mechanisms exemplifies how power is maintained through both coercion and ideological manipulation. Central to the regime's control is the Digital Security Act (DSA), which curtails free expression and dissent by criminalizing a wide array of online activities. This act plays a crucial role in stifling opposition narratives, leaving citizens with little recourse to challenge government policies. The extrajudicial killings and forced disappearances carried out by state forces, particularly the Rapid Action Battalion, RAB are emblematic of the repressive tactics used to instill fear, silence opposition, and deter public mobilization. These acts underscore Althusser's notion of repressive state apparatuses which function to preserve the status quo through violent enforcement and intimidation. Equally significant is the weaponization of the judicial system to target opposition leaders, a tactic designed to incapacitate political competitors. As detailed in various reports such as those found in Global Bangladesh and Eurasia Review, the government has used the judiciary to arrest opposition leaders, imprison them on questionable charges, and otherwise undermine any challenge to the Awami League's dominance. By manipulating the legal system, the regime neutralizes political rivals, consolidating its grip on power. Alongside its repressive mechanisms, the Awami League wields powerful ideological state apparatuses that shape public consciousness and maintain political legitimacy. Media control plays a pivotal role in constructing a narrative that casts the ruling party as the rightful defender of the nation's interests. State-owned media outlets propagate a vision of progress, largely ignoring the broader social and political consequences of government policies. This ideological alignment of media with state power creates a pervasive narrative, one that reinforces the legitimacy of the Awami League's leadership. The government's ability to control this narrative ensures that dissenting voices are not just suppressed, but marginalized and delegitimized. The historical distortion of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's legacy, as explored in Eurasia Review, further highlights the state's ideological apparatus at work. Through state-sponsored media and cultural productions, the Awami League has elevated Mujib's image, often at the expense of historical accuracy. By distorting the past, the regime constructs a national myth where Sheikh Mujib is not only revered as a founding father but as a transcendent figure whose legacy must remain uncontested. Such efforts create a monolithic national identity, one that excludes alternative interpretations of history and imposes a singular state-approved narrative.
Hasina's government has effectively leveraged nationalist sentiments to consolidate support. As seen in the India Today article, the strategic use of organic nationalism reinforces the state's ideological power. National pride, rooted in the achievements of the Sheikh family, is employed as a tool to divert attention from the regime's growing authoritarianism and to instill a sense of duty and loyalty among the populace. By constructing a narrative that frames opposition as an existential threat to national identity, the regime diminishes any legitimate critique, transforming political discourse into a moral struggle between good, the government, and evil, the opposition.
As Chantal Mouffe stated in Agnostics, Thinking the World Politically, the awakening of the discourses constructing political identities in terms of left and right has not meant the disappearance of the need for a we-they distinction. Such a distinction is still very much alive. However, today it is increasingly established through a moral vocabulary. This is something that we can see at work in many different areas nowadays. The inability to formulate the problems facing society in a political way and to envisage political solutions to these problems leads to framing an increasing number of issues in moral terms. This is, of course, not good for democracy because when the opponents are not defined in a political but in a moral way, they cannot be seen as adversaries but only as enemies. With the evil ones, no agnostic debate is possible. They have to be eliminated.
The interplay between the Awami League's repressive and ideological strategies becomes particularly evident when examining the response to civil protests. In 2024, large-scale protests driven by growing public discontent over economic inequality and political repression were met with a violent state crackdown. The regime's response was not solely physical, it also involved a moral disqualification of the protesters. As outlined in India Today, the state framed these demonstrations as disloyal and unpatriotic, thus transforming political conflict into a battle of morals. This dynamic where physical repression is paired with ideological delegitimization prevents any genuine debate, positioning the ruling party as morally unassailable. This combination of ideological manipulation and coercive force mirrors Althusser's analysis of state power, wherein the ruling class perpetuates control not only through violent force, but through the creation of a false consciousness that discourages critical engagement with the status quo. The regime's use of propaganda, coupled with the systematic silencing of dissent, serves to obliterate the distinction between the political and the moral, creating a society where opposition is not merely a political act, but a moral transgression. This effectively neutralizes any challenge to the ruling party, presenting the state's narrative as the only acceptable framework for political discourse.
The Army League's rule thus exemplifies a sophisticated symbiotic relationship between repressive and ideological state apparatuses, each reinforcing the other to create an environment where political opposition is marginalized, dissent is criminalized, and the state's narrative remains uncontested. Through state-controlled media, legal manipulation, and historical revisionism, the regime has constructed a political reality where its legitimacy is seen as both natural and irrefutable. In this environment, dissent is not merely a political challenge but a moral failing, leaving little room for genuine democratic engagement. The philosophical implications of this dual strategy are profound, as they underscore the ways in which power is maintained not just through force, but through the creation of an ideological order that aligns individual desires with the interests of the state. This case study illustrates the powerful convergence of ideology and repression in maintaining authoritarian control, highlighting the ongoing struggle between state-imposed narratives and the pursuit of political and social freedoms.